Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Today I bring you an exclusive wide-ranging interview with Jacob ReesMogg as we toured a biscuit factory, yes, biscuit factory, yesterday. I'll also speak to former Lib Dem MP Norman Lamb on Sadiq Khan and drug reform. All that to come after your morning headlines.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. It's 9:32. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has ordered ministers to cut around 90,000 civil service jobs. He hopes the move will free up billions of pounds to ease the cost of living crisis. During a Cabinet away day in Stoke-on-Trent, Boris Johnson told ministers to report back within a month. He's looking to return civil service staff numbers to 2016 levels. The DUP set to block the election of a Stormont Speaker when the Assembly convenes for the first time since the local elections. It's in protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol, which it says creates economic barriers with the rest of the UK. The DUP also says it won't nominate a Deputy First Minister, preventing a new executive from forming. The Foreign Secretary says it's vital to keep putting pressure on Russia by supplying more weapons to Ukraine. The EU's announced it's providing a further £425 million worth of military support. At the G7 summit, Liz Truss also said tougher sanctions are needed.
It's very important at this time that we keep up the pressure on Vladimir Putin by supplying more weapons to Ukraine, by increasing the sanctions. G7 unity has been vital during this crisis to protect freedom and democracy, and we'll continue to work together to do just that.
And 500,000 adults are said to be waiting for social care in England. That's an increase of more than 200,000 on last year, according to research by the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services. It says the sector's seeing a growing shortage of workers and the problems being exacerbated by low pay. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom with the briefing.
Hello and welcome back to The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. It's 9:34. Now, a little bit of an unusual, a bit of a special move this morning. Yesterday, I caught up with UK Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob ReesMogg. That's right, we toured a biscuit factory together. We were in the Midlands, of course, as the Cabinet met for its regional Cabinet meeting, focusing on the cost of living. My discussion ranged from everything from energy costs to the cost of living to what's going on with Brexit. Here's what Jacob ReesMogg had to say when I caught up with him yesterday. Welcome to Elks, one of the premier biscuit factories in the UK. Inside, I caught up with Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob ReesMogg to have a look at what's going on with how the government is acting with business. What did you think of the factory overall?
Well, it's part of British industry, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's automated, it's efficient, it's brilliant that it's been given a new lease of life by the takeover.
Struggling a bit with energy costs.
Of course. And energy costs are a problem for everybody at the moment. And what we've got to do is to increase our own domestic energy supply, and that means get as much as we possibly can out of the North Sea, and looking at if there are any other options that we can extract energy from.
One of those options, of course, is looking again at British natural shale gas onshore, which is being reviewed. Which
the government's committed to doing, yes. Because it's very interesting. At the moment, the wholesale price of gas has fallen very sharply in the UK because of the imports we've had of liquid gas, and therefore there is an oversupply in the UK. So it's a mistake to think of the gas market as a global market in the way the oil market is. It's a succession of local markets depending on local supply.
The Americans have much cheaper gas because of their shale revolution, of course.
Absolutely right.
Is that something that we might be considering copying?
Well, it's certainly being reviewed. And we've got trillions of cubic feet of gas that we're sitting on. So, you know, businesses like this are very dependent. They heat every biscuit for 9 minutes. So that is an enormous amount of energy that is being used.
And they don't just heat that biscuit once, because the etymology of biscuit, going back to the Latin,
It's twice baked.
Twice baked. And I wanted to ask you about twice baked, because in 2019, Boris Johnson stood with a Brexit deal that he said was oven ready. And I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Well, it depends, of course, what you mean by oven ready, but very often if you have something that is oven ready, an oven ready turkey, you want to have the raised potatoes and the bread sauce, which need to be made homemade. And what we need is the raised potatoes and the bread sauce, and that's dealing with the Northern Ireland Protocol, which the treaty itself says is subject to renegotiation. There is provision within the treaty to do that.
Article 13 brackets 8, but
We've been
does the
trying to
EU understand that that's our position?
Well, we've been making that very clear to them. If in the end they refuse to move, if they're not willing to act in good faith, then we will have to do things for ourselves. That's obviously the case. We can't accept disruption within the United Kingdom.
And clearly the government is acting as if it wants to protect the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. That's something that I believe the government really does genuinely believe. But I don't think the EU believe that the government believes it's doing that.
I don't think it's worth trying to work out what the EU believes, that becomes a rather philosophical question. I think it wants to make the UK feel bad for having left the European Union. That underpins its whole policy, and it doesn't really mind about the consequences of that. And we just have to get on with life and recognise that we've left, we've got to make our own way, we're an independent country, and what the EU wants or thinks is secondary.
Is talking over then? Have we just sort of given up on that part?
You'll have to ask the Foreign Secretary, but I think she's been saying some interesting things today, and the Paymaster General, Michael Ellis, has made a speech in Brussels today, making it pretty clear that we are, if not at the end of the road, very close to it.
And I suppose next week, as we start in that week, we may well be seeing some legislation. Is the idea that we plough ahead and we try and fix this by ourselves and don't worry so much about the consequences? Some of those consequences could affect businesses not necessarily that are importing, but that are exporting, businesses potentially like factories like these.
Well, to cancel the TCA, the European Union would need unanimity, and it seems to me that's a pretty high bar to get. And you have to say to the European Union, does it really want to punish its consumers at a time of rising inflation? And inflation in a lot of EU countries is higher than it is in the UK. They really want to make prices even higher for their consumers and their voters? I think that's an interesting, important question.
It sounds a bit like brinkmanship, and it's a strong moral argument you're making here that clearly it would be a self-inflicted wound for the European Union to whack up tariffs to try and start a trade war, even though we might not retaliate. But it does sound like we're running these 2017 to 19 arguments all over again.
Well, we can't tell the EU what to do. We have to have an idea of what it may do. And it may decide that it wants an act of self-harm. That is not under our control. But it would be a pretty silly thing for it to do. And we have to govern in our own interest, not constantly dancing around what the EU thinks or doesn't think. We've left. It's not our business anymore.
I suppose when it comes to Northern Ireland, we treat it as a special case in so many ways. Is it time potentially that the EU just accepts that there may be a bit of leakage into the single market, but ultimately British food isn't poisonous? I don't ask for checks when I have a meal in France. Do we need to be a bit more grown up here?
I went to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic a few years ago, and I met an absolutely marvellous man in a village called Red Lion. And he said to me, it doesn't matter what you do, things will go back and forth across the border regardless. He'd been running a shop that his grandmother had set up, and borders had come and gone, but things had gone across the border back and forth in different ways, one way or another, throughout that period. And I think that sort of good common sense approach is very refreshing.
Elsewhere in the UK, there were checks to be coming in this summer. Now, you've been passionately arguing in Cabinet against those checks. Those checks have been delayed. My question to you is, why do we need those checks at all? If we're to think that we'd happily have food on holiday in the European Union, do we need SPS checks from the EU at all?
My view is we want to get rid of them, minimise them at any rate, from the rest of the world. So this is stage one, and stage two is loosening checks on New Zealand and Australia and other countries that have very high standards that we recognise. Did you know that we inspect 5% of New Zealand apples? But there's no purpose in this. It's just sheer bureaucracy, and it adds costs to consumers. So we're working towards a single trade window that will make trade with everyone more efficient. And it seemed to me it was pretty silly to put up non-tariff barriers to the EU in the hope of taking them down again in 18 months' time.
So potentially these SPS checks have not been delayed. Potentially they'll never come in.
Or they'll be different. I mean, the idea that you needed a vet to go and look at a packet of cheese wrapped in cellophane, why were we thinking that was necessary? Or tin cans had to be inspected. What were we thinking about? What was this terrible danger that was inserting itself into a tin can?
Well, let's continue this conversation a little bit outside the factory. It's got to let you get on with the talk.
Thank you. Come on, you've got to straighten that one.
Exactly. Well, I think that's exactly what's happening.
Just pat them down.
The irritating thing about this is I think these are all looking perfect.
Well, they are looking pretty good.
I need to wait until I find something that's slightly out of line.
Yes, you're doing very well.
I feel like I might have messed that one up a little bit more.
You want me to reach all the way over there? Yeah, I think if I reach for that one, I might fall into the machine. And then it'll be like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. You'll have me packaged in an Asda packet.
Well, we've just got back to Euston Station after having a look at some industry in the Midlands, and Jacob ReesMogg looking at the issue of levelling up. This is what it really means, isn't it? We're standing here now in London that's had a lot of investment, that's had a lot of growth, but it doesn't feel like that in other parts of the country.
Well, part of it's symbolic, and that's why I think it's important that the Cabinet went to Stoke to show that we are a government for the whole of the United Kingdom, not just for London. We are a very London-centric society, so I think the symbolism is important, and I hope that we will go to more places and go to Edinburgh, Belfast and Cardiff to remind people that the Cabinet represents the whole of the United Kingdom. But you're right, Stoke has fallen behind on some measures, and it's time that it got the advantages that other places have got, and that requires government delivering a degree of opportunity for Stoke.
When you say government delivering, what does that mean? Because you ask various people what levelling up, the defining mission of this government is to level up. You talk to someone like the Tees Valley Mayor Ben Houchin, he would say it's about government getting out of the way.
It's about the government providing a ladder so that people can climb up for themselves, help them by their own effort and ingenuity to get things done, ensure that when you've got a site that needs to be redeveloped in Stoke-on-Trent, that it's not weighed down by regulations that stop it happening when an old factory wishes to become an innovation centre and have lots of other businesses there, where we were earlier on today, where the Cabinet was itself held, that there aren't regulations that get in the way of that. It's about allowing people to make the most of their own opportunities. Government can't do everything, but it can create the circumstances that allow people to do things, or perhaps it can create the circumstances which stop people doing things, and that's what you want to get away from, the negativity that you get from over-regulation and high bureaucracy.
See, when you talk about levelling up in that sense, it sounds like a coherent philosophy. It sounds like something that sort of makes sense. However, when some other people in the Cabinet talk about levelling up, sometimes it sounds a bit confused. Is it something about big, grand infrastructure projects? Is it about just simply making town centres better with more taxpayer funding? It doesn't seem like there is a big, coherent thread running through it.
Taxpayer money will not level up of its own accord. You need entrepreneurs. I met a brilliant entrepreneur earlier on today who's built his company. He told me for the first 6 months he lived off his credit card, and he's built a company up to £80 million of turnover, and he's a software engineer. And that's terrific. That just needs the government to get out of the way and let him get on with it. Infrastructure is important. There's very clear economic evidence that good road infrastructure is very important in guiding economic growth. But it's also internet connection, which allows people to connect with businesses not just in the country but around the world. And there are bits that the government can do that are infrastructure related. There are bits of expenditure, but it's pump priming and it's removing obstacles. It's not the sort of 1960s Harold Wilson, let's build a factory here because we know better than the market.
But specifically on the cost of living, these measures that we keep hearing may come about in a form of an announcement, maybe some sort of fiscal event before the autumn. What exactly is it that's being explored? We're hearing potentially a windfall tax on the table again.
You've got to be very careful about thinking what the government can do about the cost of living in terms of fiscal events. That the issue with inflation is that it is borne down upon by monetary policy tightening and fiscal policy remaining restrained. The things you can do that are positive are the supply side reforms to make the doing of business easier. The problem with spending more money is you make the inflationary problem worse rather than better. And this is very difficult for politicians because with the cost of living problem, there aren't easy popular things to do. And if you do those, you make the problem worse. So you have to do, as Margaret Thatcher showed in the 1980s, the things that need to be done. And if you explain to voters why you're doing them, what the reasoning is, and they then see the long-term benefit, that is then rewarded. But you can't take short-term expensive measures because they just make things worse.
Lots of people point to the hundreds of billions that were spent over the peak of the pandemic, that something like that could happen again. But your argument seems to be now that actually potentially some of that spending has led to some of the inflation we're seeing now.
The two things that have led to the inflation, well, there are a number of things. There's the war in Ukraine and there is the supply side issues that have beset the world. So you've got containers in the wrong ports and all of that's been pushing up costs. But the two domestic things were the quantitative easing from 2008 and the extreme government expenditure to deal with COVID. Now that money was the right thing to do and the quantitative easing was the right thing to do, but to do either of those now would be adding fuel to the flames. So both of those have to be wound back and brought under control.
So what you're saying potentially with regards to government fiscal events of the kind that we saw over the last 2 years is unless a huge war or potentially pandemic, never again.
Well, what was done 2 years ago ensured that the structures of the economy survived. Oddly, not to have spent that money would have been even more inflationary because if you look around this station, if we hadn't had furlough, if we hadn't had bounce-back loans, every shop here would have closed. The railway would have gone out of business. So that money ensured that the economy maintained supply for when it reopened.
But
so
ultimately
oddly, the
that money has
expenditure
to...
was non-inflationary to start with, but to continue with that level of expenditure would be extremely inflationary.
And potentially what we are experiencing now, this cost of living squeeze, is in part a consequence of that, however necessary it was.
Inevitably, if the government runs a large deficit and interest rates remain very low and there's 875 billion of quantitative easing, those add domestic inflationary pressures in addition to the global ones that have been driving this.
One of the other points of the pandemic that seems to be lasting now is a drive that you've been involved with the civil service. I'm talking, of course, about getting people back into work. It does seem that the private sector has found some pretty innovative ways to do hybrid working in 2 days out 3 or vice versa. But many government departments aren't even reaching that sort of hybrid flexibility. What is your solution other than just asking very nicely?
Well, I think asking very nicely is not a bad way to start. You need to work out what work needs to be done in the office. And we know where there are problems, don't we? There are problems with passports and there are problems with driving licences. That's very straightforward. People need to be in the office to do that. There are some things that people can do perfectly respectably from home and make that work. And there are some things where there's a bit of both. Though I'm a little suspicious that the days most people want to work from home turn out to be Mondays and Fridays. I think that tells you something, or hints at something at the very least. But civil servants have a contract. They should be expected, it's not unreasonable, that they should work to that contract.
So just finally, should that mean carrot or stick with regards to ensuring that people stick to that contract? We know it's very, very hard to let go people in the civil service as things stand.
I'm very much more a carrot man than a stick man.
Well, Jacob ReesMogg there talking about a wide range of things. And I have to say, I did not leave that biscuit factory empty-handed, no. Here are some of the famous Elks malted milk biscuits. They invented these biscuits back in 1908. I've got little pictures of cows on them, so I'm delighted to be tucking into those after the show. There are some benefits for doing some cabinet tours. Well, moving on to our next story today, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has been talking about drugs. Yes, he's been on a fact-finding mission visiting a cannabis farm in California. Establishing a London Drugs Commission was a manifesto pledge of his, of course, and Sadiq Khan previously called for an evidence-based approach to potential decriminalisation. Now, the National Labour Party, however, has given this short shrift, saying that it's not within the purview of his devolved administration to decriminalise drugs. But this is an interesting conversation. Could we see a reform to drug policy in the near future? And could that see any benefits? Well, joining me now is former Lib Dem MP for North Norfolk, Norman Lamb. Welcome to the programme, Norman. This is really interesting. It seems that particularly on cannabis reform, while the leaders of both major parties are still sort of trotting out the old lines on it, some senior political figures seem to be moving on the issue. It's not just Sadiq Khan with his decriminalisation ideas, but also people like William Hague recently writing in The Times that this might be something to explore. Is Britain changing its mind?
I think slowly. I remember the days when we used to have debates in Parliament, and it used to be Peter Lilly, Caroline Lucas from the Greens and myself coming together in an unusual coalition to make the case for reform. Now there are far more figures, as you say, including William Hague, which I really welcomed. The public, incidentally, are way ahead of the politicians on this. A majority now support, in opinion polls, support the legalisation of cannabis. They're, of course, conscious that members of their own family are using cannabis. Many of them have used cannabis in their younger years, and indeed many of them will be continuing to use them sometimes for medicinal purposes to deal with pain relief and so on. So I think there is a sort of an emerging picture here of support for reform, but the politicians and the leaders of the two main parties remain firmly fixed on sort of defending the status quo, which in my view has been a catastrophic disaster and fails to protect young people from harm.
I'm really interested in, because it's really clear looking at most opinion polls, even people in some of the older age brackets where you might expect people to be more temperamentally conservative with a small c on this issue. Even the older age brackets seem to be more split, indeed in some polls leaning in favour of decriminalisation at the very least. Why is it then that the leader of the Labour Party and the leader of the Conservative Party are so implacably opposed to such ideas?
It does seem extraordinary, as you say. It would be a popular measure. It would bring in very significant tax revenues. It would legalise a part of the economy which is currently firmly fixed in the criminal market. We managed to allow, billions of pounds of profits to go to organised crime. We criminalise young people, and as I said earlier, we fail to protect young people from harm. One of the real problems we have is that the strains of cannabis, skunk, that's available on the streets of London, for example, and many of our other cities, is very potent. If you have a legal, regulated market, as they now have, for example, in Canada, then you can control the potency of the products that are available through the legal market, and you can start to undermine the criminal activity. So it makes a lot of sense. I think there's a fear that there would be a backlash of some sort, a sort of fear that the Daily Mail might attack them. But really, what we see across in the United States is that one state after another, and it's not just the sort of normal suspects of liberal states that have gone for reform. State after state has voted through on referendums in their own states, reforms to the law which regularises this market. And it would seem to me, just as Peter Lilly recognised in those early debates in Parliament, it would seem to me to be something that ought to be attractive to many Conservatives. It is about, Sorry.
Certainly the idea that the market is better placed to regulate something, or at least an open market rather than a black one, would certainly seem Good. I mean, I'm reminded of prohibition in the United States, where, of course, alcohol consumption went up when they banned it, or indeed more potent alcohol consumption went up. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme here. It's a really interesting discussion, one I hope to have again sometime soon. But Norman Lamb, thank you so much for joining us on the briefing this morning. Well, that's it today. Coming up, it's To the Point, but first is the weather.
Good morning, Alex Deacon here with your latest weather update. A fine day out there today for the vast majority, a bit warmer than yesterday, a bit breezy in places and actually quite windy in northern Scotland where there will be showers. A couple of sets of weather fronts just drifting in here and the isobars are squeezing together, but high pressure isn't too far away and that will bring, as I say, for most of us a fine day, but a noticeable breeze and the strong winds in northern Scotland bringing in quite a bit of rain across the Highlands, pushing northwards across the Northern Isles, but the Central Belt probably dry, southern Scotland, Northern Ireland also dry and bright. And for England and Wales, the sunshine a little hazy this morning, but I think we'll see that high cloud disappearing and certainly most of England and Wales blue skies this afternoon. Yes, there is a bit more of a breeze, but temperatures are higher than yesterday's. By this afternoon, widely over 20 Celsius across the Midlands and eastern England. 23 is possible, 15 in Glasgow, so feeling a little fresher here and certainly across the far northwest with that gusty wind and a few showers, which will keep going through this evening, but for most it's dry and fine. If you're heading out with clear skies as the winds ease, it could just turn a little misty in a few spots through the early hours, so perhaps a little misty and murky first thing on Saturday morning. Certainly a colder night tonight than the one just gone, widely down to single figures and some spots not too far off freezing to start Saturday morning, but quite quickly. The sun's got some welly in it now, so that will lift the temperatures, should clear any mist and fog, and then plenty of sunny spells across the country on Saturday. Still a few showers over the Northern Isles, and notice the cloud increasing across the south. So the sunshine may be turning hazy here once more in the afternoon, but generally a warm day with temperatures in the high teens, low 20s, maybe 24, 25, somewhere around the London area. But there is the risk of thundery showers then drifting up from the south, developing across France, heading northwards on Saturday night. Still the potential for some heavy showers around on Sunday for England and Wales, but most of Scotland and Northern Ireland should be dry.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle, and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursday.